This week, the handle assembly for my sword for the Aluminum Viking Pulse Raid. Got it all finished, leather wrapped the handle, brass transferred the pommel and crossguard, and I filled the hole that I created with the mill last week. See? Anything can be fixed. So I took this chunk of oak, marked it where I had marked the tang, took it outside of the chop saw, cut it to length, then brought it in, cut it to width, and then cut the piece I was going to use for the handle in half, lengthwise. Once I had them cut in half, I sanded them nice and smooth and flat, and then marked out the area where I was going to groove for the tang. I used the bandsaw to score ridges to make it a little easier, and then once I had scored ridges down about the depth that I wanted, I chiseled it out and then started sanding. I wanted this to be a reasonably tight fit, so instead of trying to use power tools that I'm just not precise enough with, I just did a series of trial and error using a combination of files and sandpaper wrapped around bar stock. Once I was happy with the fit, I coated both sides with a good coat of Gorilla Glue, clamped them together, wiped off all the excess, and stuck them in the vise so that they could sit overnight. Next morning, I did a fitment test, and it was still a little tighter than I wanted it to be, so instead of trying to mess with the wood, I chose to grind just a little bit more off the tang. Once I had a fit I was happy with, I took it to the belt sander, and I think I make this mistake every time. I get started, and then there's no way, this is going to take too long. So the stock went back on the tang, and I removed a good majority of the wood to get the profile that I wanted, just using a flap disc. I tended to keep a lot of the worn out sanding disc, flap discs that I use for grinding metal, keep those around when it comes time to working with wood. They do a pretty good job. Most of the grit's still worn away, but they spin fast enough that they can remove wood reasonably efficiently, but not so aggressively that it really tears it up beyond sandable. And when I had it sanded down where it was reasonably comfortably in my hand, I sanded to remove all of the flap disc marks and got it nice and smooth. I was originally planning on staining this, but I went in a different direction. Took a thin, lightweight piece of cardboard, traced out the area that's going to be underneath the crossguard, squared up the lines, and marked the center. I drew half of what I wanted the crossguard to look like and then cut it out with a razor knife. I then transferred that pattern with a pencil to 1/8 inch bar stock, and just basically transferred the pattern by drawing one side, flipping it over, and doing the other side. And I did that twice to make both sides of the crossguard. Cut the bars to length with the bandsaw, and then proceeded to cut out the crossguards by nibbling. The bandsaw blade won't make these curves in such thick steel, so I make a little notch and cut, make a little notch and cut, make a little notch and cut. Much easier with a nice sharp bandsaw blade, by the way. Clamped the two pieces together, drilled a hole in the center, and left the drill bit in there to help keep everything aligned. And once I had it all clamped together and lined up, I started the process of grinding these things to a nice, clean, reasonable profile. Once I had everything ground down, I took a piece of 1/2 inch wide, each 1/8 inch thick bar stock, and started just banging it and welding it to the profile of the other two pieces. What I would do is I'd weld a short section in and use the heat from having welded it to help bend the stock. Hit it with a hammer a few times or clamp it in a way that it would allow me to get the back to the profile, and then work on the next section. And I just did this a little bit at a time. Since I quite frequently needed to leave myself an extra little bit of stock to get leverage, when I'd reached that point in time where I had more material, I'd just cut it off, bang it back into place, and then weld the seams up, grind it down eventually, and smooth it out that way. And with everything welded up nice and tight, I started the grinding process. I usually start the grinding process with grinding all of the flat sections, grinding the welds down where you can no longer see the weld seams. And then once I've got all of the flat sections, I go back and tackle the corners and try and get them rounded out nice and neat. This is going to be up by my hand, so I wanted to make sure that there were no real sharp edges. I marked the area where the tang would come through the crossguard and then took a pair of wing dividers and scribed the center line. I then milled a 1/4 inch channel in the bottom of the crossguard, and because I don't have an end mill big enough, I had to flip the crossguard over and hope that I managed to get this thing centered. And I got lucky this time and it worked out. Cleaned everything up with a round file, test fitted the crossguard to make sure that it actually fit, and then had to clean up the corners a little bit so that it sat square on the bottom of the sword. And now it's time to repair last week's mistake with the mill. Cut a couple pieces of thin aluminum flat stock, drilled out a section so that it would slightly resemble the profile at the top of the blade where I had done the fuller. Marked them so I could keep them straight, and then guessed where the edges were appropriately. It's going to be filled with weld beads, so in the end it wouldn't matter. Marked out a couple of straight lines, cut them to size, and then stuck them on the welding table and started filling them with aluminum filler bar. I am a terrible TIG welder, but I'm an amazing grinder. Once I had both filler pieces in, I smoothed out the thing. It's going to end up making the filler a little shorter than I originally wanted, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. And it's onto the pommel. Traced out basic line for what I wanted the pommel to look like, and then I used a socket to create the rounded edges. In retrospect, what I should have done was the same thing I did with the crossguard and made half of this and flipped it over because it's not quite symmetrical, and that drives me crazy. But there's nothing I can do about that now. So I finished cutting out the template, traced it to the same flat stock that I used, and then using the same cutting and nibbling technique with the bandsaw, I cut these to some basic shape. These actually ended up being way more difficult than I expected to fabricate. My wife's is going to be a little more simple, I think. And once I had the two pieces cut out, clamped them together to keep them uniform, and I just started trying to cut them down with a combination of filing and sanding and grinding. I milled the channel in the bar stock where the tang will come through the bottom of the pommel, cleaned it up with a file, and then clamped everything together on my wonderful welding table so that everything was 90 degrees. Drilled the pieces out so that I had a centering rod. Again, this is where the pin's going to be through, and I helped use this to keep everything lined up. More tack welding, test fitting, and then stitch welding. And I did the same thing essentially with this one that I did with the other one. Fabricate a short section, bend or bang, whatever I needed to do to get the piece back into profile, then weld a little further and move on to the next piece. I then used a combination of a flap disc, a cutoff wheel, file, and grinder to get the profile back to some semblance of curviness. Drilled the hole and drove a temporary pin in to hold everything in place while I did the rest of the test fitting. Put the pommel on, marked the aluminum bar where the pommel goes, and then drilled it out. I took the steel pieces out into the driveway and proceeded to heat them with a torch and transfer the brass using the wire wheel technique that I've used in a couple of the other videos. Once everything was cooled down, I took them inside and gave them a nice good coat of clear enamel. I used a corner of a file to grind a little line in the end, and that's where I'm going to put the string and use it to hold the string in place. And then just proceeded to wrap this cord around the handle, and this actually ended up being a little more difficult than I expected. I fumbled around for a few minutes before I finally got the knot tied off, but once I had the knot tied off and everything secured, I cut the trimmed piece and measured the grip for the leather. I cut the piece to length and then cut another piece with a generous width, allowing a little bit of overlap. After a test fit, squared up the edges so that I had a nice, clean, smooth line, and marked a section on the nylon rope where I was going to use as a guide. Coated the handle and the leather piece with some contact cement, let it dry, and put it in place just to hold everything temporarily while I got things situated. I wrapped the handle, marked the leather, and cut it to length. And from there, I took some Q-tips and some Gorilla Glue and pretty well saturated the rope so that it would hold well. Do a sort section, wrap it, do another section and wrap it, and do another section and wrap it. When I had it all coated, I coated the edge as best I could with a little bit of the Gorilla Glue and then closed everything up and just wrapped it with some random string that I had laying around. Side note, if you're interested in the wire-wrapped look of a leather handle, you can wrap this more tightly with the string that you used to wrap the inside of the handle, and it'll make a really neat mark. From there, I trimmed the ends and cut a bunch of little darts in there. Took super glue, and just one section at a time, I'd super glue and lay the pieces over, super glue, lay the pieces over, and just continued until I had the whole thing done. The pin for the crossguard went in easily. I just cut it to length and then stuck it in there. The pommel, I had to grind a long pin down, and then hammer it in at an angle, get everything squared up, and then cut it to length. A little bit of cleanup work left to do. There's some filing on the pins. I've got to clean up the pommel a little bit and still the area at the bottom of the fuller. But the sword is done, ready for the scabbard. I will make that this week, and that will be next week's video. From there, it will be on to the belts and tunic. I think I'm going to make a helmet out of aluminum. We'll see. Have a great week.